And let me introduce Professor Izabela Kalinowska. She's our own Stony Brook professor, and we used to be in the same department, and now Izabela is in the English department. She teaches literature, including Russian literature, by the way. So those of you who are interested in our Russian minor, for example, and you want to take HUR courses, chances are you're going to take courses with Professor Izabela, but also she actually used to teach the Russian cinema course before me. So I'm following in her footsteps. And so please welcome.
Hello, hello. Hi, all. It's good to be here with you today. And I'm going to begin with some questions. So I'm assuming that you guys have seen Pavel Chuhray's The Thief, a film he made in 1997. The film became an international hit. It was nominated for the Oscar, and that has been the case for just very, very few Russian films. So I'm going to begin by asking you some questions about the film. And I'm going to speak for about half an hour. In my remarks, I want to primarily provide you with a broader context for the interpretation of this film. You know, as sophisticated viewers and interpreters of texts, including visual texts, you can decipher the film on probably multiple levels for yourselves, but I think I can provide some important context. So my first question to you would be, what genre do you think we are dealing with here? How would you characterize the genre of this film, The Thief? So a tragedy, a personal tragedy for Katya, for her son, right? We could maybe call it a melodrama, right? Because when this such personal tragedies that sort of play out within the family are projected on the screen, we talk about melodramas. Any other generic categories that come to mind? Like, what larger groups of films would you place The Thief in? Historical drama, yes, we're moving in the right direction. Drama, historical drama. Now, if you take the adjective first into consideration, historical, can we specify that? So we want to be a little bit more specific. The historical context is that of World War II. So we can safely categorize this film as belonging to a larger group of war films, right? War films sort of broadly conceived, because there are several definitions of the genre of war films, and clearly this is not a combat film. This is sort of war film very narrowly defined, but this film definitely belongs to a larger group of war films that are set during the time of war or the immediate post-war, as is the case here, context. So the Second World War is very present, right? We sort of know that the father, Katya's husband, set off for the war and he didn't come back. And we know that Tolian may be a war veteran. He's wearing a war uniform. So we are assuming that he is a war veteran. That war had just ended, right? So in a very broad context, we can categorize this film as one that is addressing issues that are specific to the war and the immediate post-war period. And within the context of Russian cinema, war has always been a very important topic, sort of critically important. So I want to make 2 points, very general points about Soviet and Russian cinema. First of all, Soviet cinema was always extremely politicized, right? And we know that, you guys probably know it, when it starts in the early 1920s, cinema is nationalized in 1919 in the Soviet Union, and film production begins in the early 20s. And, the filmmakers who begin to be active back then are themselves extremely political, right? They know that this is the expectation of the state. The state is creating the film industry. And they are also sort of zealous, eager participants in this national endeavor. Long story short, film is to serve as political propaganda during Soviet times, right? And you may have heard, Professor Geshark may have quoted Lenin. There's this quote from Lenin that is very often repeated and sort of taken out of context when he said that, quote, "For us, cinema is the most important of all arts." Like, why would Lenin say that cinema was the most important of the arts? Obviously, he was a genius strategist, but political, ideological strategist, but he was not a connoisseur of fine art, right? So why would he say that? We bear in mind the fact that most of the population in the newly created Soviet Union was illiterate, right? So here, indeed, radio and film could be used as just perfect propaganda tools. And within that, well, they were also creating, revolutionary theater in those days. But definitely the Bolsheviks saw the cinema as a new art, right? It was a very new art. And that's why also sort of ideologically, since they were modernizing the Soviet Union and everything that was conceived to be modern, they also embraced the cinema, right? The early filmmakers, Dziga, Eisenstein, Pudovkin, scores of other filmmakers knew that their role was to be propagandists for the Soviet state, right? And the Soviet state was there to kind of, supervise their work and censor it appropriately. And since the beginning, the subject of the war occupied sort of a central position within Soviet filmmaking. So, first it was the period of the war that followed civil war, that followed the revolution, right? That was taken as the topic of for filmmakers, the revolution itself, and then, of course, the Second World War. So the war occupies a central position in Soviet filmmaking. And again, it's within the framework of a film industry that is extremely politicized, right? So why the subject of the war? Well, it allowed filmmakers and sort of their state ideological sponsors to mobilize the population, right? If there's a war, there's always an enemy, and you fight against the enemy, and you have to vanquish the enemy, and you unify your people. So this becomes, again, particularly pronounced after the Second World War, right? So we talk about the crucial importance of the myth of World War II in Soviet culture. And there are some very good publications about it if anyone is interested. So people recognize that, this is an important area for Soviet film production, post-Soviet film production as well, and that it has been always extremely politicized. So to give you an example, I'm going to show you a clip from a film made in 1950 entitled The Fall of Berlin. And you will understand how war film becomes political propaganda. In this case, it's very overt, so we are just going to play this. So what you are seeing in this picture, again, made in 1950, is the exact moment that we see in The Thief, right? So it's the exact post-World War II moment. The war had just ended, and Stalin arrives to Berlin. There's sort of interesting imagery that is somewhat reminiscent of a film that glorified Hitler that was made in the 1930s. by Hitler's favorite filmmaker, Leni Riefenstahl. So we see Stalin first as he's flying over Berlin, and then the airplane lowers down to the airfield, and Stalin disembarks, right? So here you have it. So he's kind of already presented as a god figure, right? He's descending down from the sky.
Здравствуйте, товарищ Чуйков. Здравствуйте, товарищ Конин. Здравствуйте, товарищ Рогосовский. Примите мою благодарность за замечательно проведенную операцию по окружению Берлина. Сегодня мы празднуем великую победу над германским фашизмом. Дорогой ценой приобретена эта победа. Не забывайте принесенных вами жертв. Отныне история открывает перед народами, любящими свободу, широкий путь. Каждый народ должен бороться за мир во всем мире, за счастье простых людей, всех стран, всех народов. Только тогда можно будет сказать, что наши жертвы не пропали даром, что каждый из нас сможет твердо смотреть в свое будущее.
Алеша? Алеша!
Наташа!
Right, yeah. So Stalin in the fall of Berlin, 1950, right? Of course, Stalin is also crucially central to the Pavel Chukhrai film. And we have a boy and a girl, of course, right? The boy and the girl are reunited happily, and Comrade Stalin is going to sort of, bless their relationship now that the war is over. There's a happy ending. And this illustrates some of the tendencies of war-centered, war-related films of the Stalinist period, most definitely, right? So we have films in which there's a lot of combat and there's always Stalin, and, there's the great heroic Soviet victory. No matter the sacrifice, the Soviet Union emerges victorious. So Soviet patriotism, Soviet victory are celebrated. And up to a certain point, there is not much focus on the personal dramas and on personal suffering, especially of the people who stayed at home. And that changes after Stalin's death. So, you can, if we were to categorize Soviet films, then you could say that, there's this group of films that emphasize heroic combat, and then another group of films that emphasize civilian suffering. And these films begin to appear, especially following Stalin's death, in the late 1950s, during the so-called period of the thaw. And actually, Pavel Chukhrai is the son of one of the central figures of that movement back in the 1950s, Grigory Chukhrai, who was a Ukrainian filmmaker, one of very prominent Soviet filmmakers, and the director of a film entitled Ballad of a Soldier. So I wanted to show you guys clips from another film from that era, another masterpiece, really, Kalatozov's Cranes Are Flying, also from 1957. Kalatozov was another genius Soviet era filmmaker who was Georgian, and he was a cameraman first, director of photography, and then a filmmaker. So he's very sensitive to the image. And what do we see in these films? We see, for the first time in Soviet cinema, an acknowledgement of the suffering and trauma that is inflicted upon the people who stay home, right? So Cranes Are Flying also sort of, begins with a love story. It is a boy and a girl, and then the boy volunteers for the front. And interestingly enough, the camera does not follow him to the front. The camera stays with his girlfriend, Veronica. And we see her emotional turmoil. We see her suffering when at some point she's pretty much raped by his cousin and enters into a relationship with that cousin. And so she is also in the category of women who were absolutely ostracized by official Soviet propaganda after the war. She's a woman who does not wait for her man, for the hero to return from the front of the Second World War, right? So she's in a relationship with this other guy. And there is no happy ending in these films of the late 1950s, beginning of the 1960s. So the guys don't return from the front. They die at the front. The women, the suffering mothers and girlfriends are left with the trauma of wartime loss. And so we get to the 1990s, right? And I always tell my students that films are very indicative. They are like a mirror. They reflect a certain political, social reality of the time. on the one hand. On the other hand, they also are meant to shape, do actually end up influencing people's perceptions, people's opinions, their thinking about that particular historical moment and their own historical moment, the one from whose perspective they are looking at the movie. So what do we have in Chuhrai's Thief, right? So this is a film that is made after the collapse of the Soviet Union, but before Putin assumes power and works towards sort of gaining a firm grip on political power in the Russian Federation, in Russia, now the post-Soviet Russia, right? So what about that moment can we decipher from this film, right? What happens to this myth of the great patriotic war? And something really fascinating actually happens in this film. And you guys know about it because you've seen the film. So the central figure of the war hero, right? The character of Talian, he turns out not to be a hero. He turns out to be a cheat, right? He is a crook. He is a thief. So this is a very serious interrogation of this Soviet era myth of the Second World War, right? And what we have instead is a certain continuation of the focus on the suffering. So there's always sort of Russian suffering is foregrounded, right? So we have the suffering of Katya and of her son, civilian suffering, right? But the central myth of the Soviet Union is here interrogated. So what do we learn from this film about, it's a revision of the myths of the past, right? It sort of invites us to think back to the past and to think back very critically. It is not only critical and revisionist when it comes to the myth of the central myth of the Second World War, but also of Stalin and Stalin's influence on Soviet society. And interestingly enough, we don't get a sermon in this film. It's not like overtly anti-Stalinist and denouncing Stalin. It's kind of, there's a certain degree of nuance, right? So there is an identification with Stalin. We are sort of led to believe that Talian perhaps represents Stalin, right? How do we know that? So charisma and, sort of the central positioning in the, he's a patriarch, right? He also usurps the position of the patriarch. And at the same time, he turns out to be a cheat. There are also some direct signals of that, we should identify Tolian with Stalin, right? He has Stalin tattooed on his body. And, there's some mention that maybe he's the son of Stalin. So he is direct, we get this hint, think of Tolian as stand-in for Stalin, right? In Russian history. And this is this very brief and fascinating moment in Russian history. When we look at Russia now, we wonder what is wrong with this place, right? How can it be like this? Why, you have a civilian population that just accepts Putin and Putinism without really questioning it much. It accepts the tens of thousands of war dead in a war that doesn't make any sense. So any signs of like this Soviet era humanism have completely evaporated. And we wonder, what is wrong with this place? And my answer would be, look at the 1990s and look at what happens in the cinema of the 1990s when we see efforts at sort of reflecting upon Stalinism and admitting the role of trauma also. So, the Russian society persists as a very severely traumatized society. And these traumas sort of, are compounded through the decades. We could add to that what happened in the 1990s with the very abrupt end of the Soviet Union. And, when you ask people who lived in the Soviet Union back in the 90s, they think of that period too as very profoundly traumatizing because they lost certainty of the social net that had existed before. The world just changed very abruptly in very radical ways, which could have been good, but it's sort of now very critically reevaluated. Anyways, we look at the thief, and it's that one moment when you have an attempt at introspection, right? Russian introspection. Let's reevaluate Stalin and Stalinism. Let's admit to ourselves that perhaps we were charmed, perhaps we were, led to believe that was the father figure that he was telling us he really was. But in fact, the legacy of Stalinism consists of millions and millions of people killed during the Stalinist purges. There was also a huge unnecessary loss of human lives during the Second World War, right, due to the fact that Stalin was not at all prepared for a Nazi invasion. He had a non-aggression treaty signed with Hitler, so he was not expecting Nazi Germany to invade at the moment when it did. So this, for me, is something that is really most fascinating about this very watchable Russian film from the 1990s, right? So it's a compelling human story. You can relate to it even without knowing anything about Russian history, about the Second World War and its impact on Russian society, about the myth of the Great Patriotic War, and still you relate to the human drama of the picture. But to me, once again, it's that one moment, it represents that one moment of introspection that unfortunately was lost when Putin came to power. And it's not clear if it's ever to return. War movies continue to be made in Russia, but once again, they amount to just horrific, artistically not very compelling political propaganda, right? Where the Second World War is presented as a parallel to a horrific war that Russia is fighting against Ukraine. So I am going to conclude here. Wonderful to meet you. I hope I'm going to have a chance to interact with you in one of my classes.